The Planting Date Conundrum for Corn. That is the title of a recent article by my favorite corn expert, now ace drone pilot, Bob Nielsen, Professor Emeritus, Purdue University. Bob, all this gnashing of teeth has a certain kind of Chicken Little tone to it. And it's not like you haven't tackled this subject before, but it seems like any year when we have planting delays, we hear the same refrain about losing yield, and yet, after, 30 years of studying this, the point that you've made so many times before is early planting may favor higher yields, but it's not necessarily a guarantee of higher yields.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great way to put it. We're not saying that it's not important. It does not guarantee high yields if you plant early, and the fact that you're planting late does not guarantee low yields either, primarily because planting date is simply one of many, many factors that ultimately influences corn yield by the end of the season.
Yeah, in fact, you indicate in the article, kind of curious about this, but over the past 20 years, half of Indiana's corn crop on average has been planted after mid-May, which is the time a lot of people get all weird about it.
Right. And that I just sort of put that together in my own head, recently too, that reality is that on an average year, half the crop is in fact planted after the middle of May. So I think that's why when we look at statewide yields, we have to keep that fact in mind that half the crop is almost always planted after the 15th of May anyway. Then if you look at those years where, say, more than half the crop is planted after mid-May, we can consider that to be a late planting season. And conversely, the years where more than half of the crop was planted before the middle of May, we can call that early seasons. And when you then compare that to ultimate statewide yields, there is a bit of a negative effect of late planting when you graph it out over, say, 20 years, but it's not a perfect relationship. And so there have been years where we've had, say, 75, 80, almost 90% of the crop planted after the middle of May. And by the end of the season, those years, we ended up somewhere around 5 to 10% above trend yield, even though so much of the crop was planted late. And then conversely, there's been a couple of years where we've planted more than half the crop before the middle of May, and yet we end up below trend yield as much as 10% below trend. And so what that tells us or reinforces is this fact I mentioned earlier, that planting date is simply one of many, many things that influences yield. Other things that are important are obviously midsummer rainfall, the timing of it, the amount of it, midsummer temperatures, especially during pollination, how quickly the crop matures in the fall, and does it mature late? So there's just a lot of things that influences yield. And I'm sure you've heard farmers say this yourself, but there are farmers around the state that when they have to plant late, sometimes they end up with not just average yields, but way above average yields, simply because the rest of the summer turned out to be perfect.
And it's interesting because, we find ourselves with, I think we can use the word soggy, at least here in the northern part of the state. And, you've talked about mudding it in before. But I think, one of the other things that you and I've talked so many times before about is the temperature of the soil and how important that is. And sometimes a little bit later on, the soil temp has come up to the point that you get maybe quicker germination.
Well, that's exactly right. When we plant, say, in late April, the soils are typically cool, and it may take, anywhere from as long as 3 weeks or 4 weeks to emerge. But when you plant, say, the middle of May or beyond, those soil temperatures are so warm that the crop is usually emerged in less than 7 days. And so it's, when we plant 3 weeks later than we want, that doesn't mean the crop emerges 3 weeks later than we want. It usually emerges more quickly. And so I think that's one of the reasons why late planting, if we're only talking, say, the latter half of May versus the first half of May, late planting doesn't have that huge effect because the crop doesn't act like it was planted late, simply because it comes up quicker.
Well, and I think, sometimes, we look too much at the calendar and not enough about the conditions out there. Right. One last thing, only a couple seconds left here. A lot of discussion about changing maybe seeding rates, and you have done so much study with that. I got to believe that factored in this discovery as well when you're talking about yields.
Well, right. I certainly, when we get into, say, late May or even early June, I certainly see no reason to reduce the seeding rates, because the evidence doesn't support it. But on the other hand, one could argue that because the soils are warmer, because the crops emerge more quickly, more uniformly, you might end up with a higher percent stand when you plant late. And so one could argue you could actually maybe reduce it a little bit for that reason. But by and large, I'd simply say let's just sort of leave seeding rate where it is, because the crop's going to do reasonably well if the rest of the season is good.
Well, and again, you point out one that I think is so important, and that is what's the weather going to be like at pollination? That's so critical.
And if only we could forecast that accurately, yes.
We'd be in good shape and very rich. Bob Nielsen, Professor Emeritus, again, so much thanks. We always get a little bit smarter when we talk to you, Bob, so thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
Podcasts by Federated Media.